So here are some of the very big questions we want to explore in this plenary. How does structural racism continue to shape the restructuring of our domestic and global economy, as well as the power disparities between the global North and South? What opportunities lie before us to move towards devising a broader framework for what a racially just global economy and society look like? What are promising models and opportunities for advancing racial and global equity? I want to offer three brief framing comments. The first one has to do with the current economic crisis. Now, we all know that we face multiple economic crises right now: the housing and mortgage crisis, the related financial and credit crisis, recession, and not just recession in the United States. We're in the midst of a global recession. Just yesterday, we learned that the 15-nation Eurozone is officially in a recession. We know we're facing serious crises when our right-wing government and its cheerleaders essentially advocate socialism to save capitalism. The public treasury is being used to bail out Wall Street and probably soon the American auto industry. But even before the onset of these most recent housing and financial crises, we already were facing, and especially communities of color were already in crisis. We already had the highest levels of economic inequality since right before the Great Depression. But the question becomes, what does race and structural racism have to do with the broad global economic crisis and meltdown? Now, from a longer-term historical perspective, the exploitation of workers and communities of color has been the central defining feature of our modern system of global racial capitalism. This exploitation of our communities was built into the economic system, whether through reliance on slave labor or the pushing, gambling on, and profiting from subprime loans. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best more than 40 years ago, quote, "The problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated," end quote. In good economic times, workers of color here and around the world are the most exploited by increasingly multinational corporations. In good economic times, workers of color are concentrated in the lowest wage sectors of the labor market, in the unregulated informal economy, in the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, and are the least likely to have health care or retirement benefits. That's in the best of economic times. But to paraphrase the old adage, when white workers sneeze, workers of color get pneumonia. Said another way, while white America is just now entering a recession, communities of color have been in a depression for quite a while. When Citibank lays off 30,000, Sun Microsystems 6,000, or Fidelity Investments 3,000, what does that mean for workers of color in the low-wage labor market, in restaurants, hotels, retail, agriculture, or healthcare? Now, I'm pretty obsessed these days with Walmart, and that's the second comment I want to talk about. Walmart epitomizes global trends and the modern practices of megacorporations and how they compound racism and inequity. As we know, Walmart's the world's largest corporation, the world's largest employer. Walmart is the largest private employer of African Americans, Latinos, and women in the United States. And in the midst of the incredible suffering in our communities, it turns out Walmart is doing just fine. This is from yesterday's front page of the Wall Street Journal, and there's an article here that says, "Walmart flourishes as economy turns sour." And let me read you the first paragraph. "Walmart stores, the nation's largest private employer, is reaping big gains from the souring economy, even as consumers cut back, retail chains struggle, and thousands lose their jobs. On Thursday, after a week of bad news from retailers such as Best Buy and Starbucks, Walmart said their earnings for the third quarter rose 10%. Lee Scott, the CEO of Walmart, said last month that Walmart was in a position to be, quote, thoughtfully aggressive in pursuing opportunities created by the downturn. He told analysts, quote, "It is quite possible that the next year will provide extraordinary opportunities for this company as the retail landscape changes." So as people lose their jobs, wages continue to go sour, Walmart's going to benefit from all of this. And this is the Walmart model in a Walmart economy, based on mass consumption, and especially mass consumption by working class and poor people and people of color. The mass consumption of cheap goods is only possible by exploiting workers of color around the world, especially through its supply chain. Through the power it exerts in its global supply chain, Walmart exploits workers of color in Asia and Latin America who produce the cheap goods that we buy. They produce these goods under the worst of working conditions. Here in our country, Walmart exploits workers of color, especially women of color, by paying low wages, lowering working standards and conditions, offering poor or no health care benefits, and especially exploiting the high rates of unemployment in the communities of color by justifying its low-wage jobs while it makes record profits. Now, as Walmart profits, it divides workers of color and communities of color, and then we are in a situation where we argue amongst ourselves about how good or bad Walmart is. I'm sure all of you shop at Target. The Target's no better. Now, if this Walmart model is an economy exemplifies the current economic trajectory, then what are some alternative questions and strategies towards building a racially just global economy and society? And that's what our panel is going to tell us about. The last thing I'll talk about very quickly has to do with this political opportunity and this political moment. This is our moment. Crises present opportunity. And this is the political opportunity we've been waiting for and organizing to create for more than 30 years. Neoliberalism and corporate-led globalization are vulnerable. The ideas undergirding neoliberalism have failed. The notions that markets are the best and only way to organize society, government and the public good is bad, deregulate and privatize everything, environmental destruction as economic progress, tax cuts for corporations and the super rich, these ideas and practices have failed. Our panel will discuss the components of effective strategies and approaches to advancing alternative economic models that advance racial justice in our current economic context. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Gilda Haas.
How is the lights with you? Okay, so the reason that I'm standing up here is because there's these bright lights, and it's better if I can actually see you a little bit here. So I'm very humbled to be here, having heard the speakers today. I'm going to tell you a story basically about my work and the communities that we work in, and hopefully have those stories elicit some kind of frame. But let me just start out by saying that one of the things that's always been racialized in the United States and has become increasingly globalized is land, and the rules about land, and now the money behind land, and the money behind land, and the derivatives of that, and the mortgages of that, et cetera, are increasingly globalized. And so for the last 10 years, SAGE has been working to build urban land reform because of what I just said. In a part of LA that's big by organizer standards, but it's tiny with respect to the global nature. Oh, I can see so much better. Thank you. But it's tiny with respect to the global nature of its problems. So our turf is South Central Los Angeles, or more specifically, the neighborhoods that are south of downtown and surround the Staples Center and the University of Southern California. This area has recently been colonized by capital and those hoping to attract capital, and in the spirit of all good colonialists, everybody's renamed the area. So the developers renamed it the Figueroa Corridor. The University of Southern California renamed it University Park. The redevelopment agency renamed it South Park. And then the city council, they actually had a meeting to rename South Central Los Angeles South Los Angeles, as though removing the word central could erase the pain and conflict from the Watts riots, the '92 rebellions, and the current class struggles over contested terrains. They seriously did this. 200,000 people live in the 10 or 11 square mile area that we now call the Figueroa Corridor. Once entirely occupied by working class people of color, it has gradually and uncomfortably begun to accommodate both economic poles of the most unequal city in the nation, pushing out the low end to make room for the high. For the present time, both extremes coexist, dancing on the same floor, but as you can imagine, they're doing really different dances. Change has been really rapid. Property values have quadrupled in the last 5 years. And to my enormous frustration, this change has produced a new common sense. So buildings that still house poor people 10 years ago and still exist, they used to be surrounded by buildings and people that look like themselves. But now, right next to a 7,000-seat live theater, a stadium, loft dwellings, the pervasive common sense by the guy on the street is that those buildings don't belong. They have to go. They don't fit in. So part of common sense is produced by what you can see with your eyes. And part of common sense is the consciousness with which you see it. And consciousness includes patterns and imprints and ideas and biases that belong to culture and experience and ideas. So if you can't know or see the injuries that move that building from the norm to the anomaly, then it's really hard to imagine a need for reconciliation and reparations. In order to determine what is fair and right in the economy, you need to witness and know and believe that human decisions were made in the face of or in the service of injustice. This is important. It's really important when you're talking about the economy, because once you know this, once you know it wasn't the market, that it wasn't a natural cycle, that it wasn't inevitable, then you can believe in change. You can witness and know and believe that other human decisions can make it right, take it back, and produce justice. So having said this, brothers and sisters, we have a lot of work to do on this $700 billion bank bailout. It is not fair and it is not right. I'm not going to talk about that, but we can talk about that a lot later. So I started working in South Central in about 1980, and there were people in South Central before me, who were there before me, who were fighters and who were way more grounded in the place, who let me stand on their shoulders as we fought redlining, as we fought the savings and loan debacle, and other structural barriers that served to strip mine the equity and the dignity from our communities. And when we started working in the Figueroa Quarter, there were, of course, people who preceded us for 30 years and let us stand on their shoulders. And one of those people is Cecilia Nunez. She's a very humble person. She'd be embarrassed if I'd be saying all this stuff about her, so I can do it now because she's not here. So Cecilia Nunez was born in the Figueroa Quarter. She's about my age. When she was a kid, she lived across the street from where Sage is. If you come to LA and you visit Sage, it'll look like an industrial area, but she used to live in a sweet little duplex right across the street. And when she walked to school, she watched the houses in her neighborhood that she thought were perfectly nice houses get torn down and get replaced by brick and concrete warehouses and factories that housed really crappy jobs. Finally, adding insult to injury, the school district threatened to take her neighborhood by eminent domain to build a school. So she couldn't see the racial expulsive zoning that replaced residential land uses with industrial ones. This was happening in communities of color all across the country in the 60s and the 70s. She couldn't see it, but she knew it was wrong. And with quiet determination, she stayed in her neighborhood. She became a legal secretary, proud of her professional status, and managed to transcend redlining and gender discrimination and bought a house, although she did have to pay interest rates of 16 and 17%. And in those days, they didn't even have the 2% come on, but at least she knew she could afford it. She still has her house, unlike a lot of people in this country. She was there when the redevelopment agency, to accommodate the university's expansion, took nearby stores and homes by eminent domain, tore them down. This is in 1970. They left it there as rubble for 4 years. That's how disrespectful they were to the community, South Central. She was there when the university held community meetings about a commercial development that was going to be built at the corner of Figueroa and Jefferson and promised 2,000 jobs to the community. We still have the flyers. And they just kept it as a parking lot for 13 years, and then they put a stadium on it last year. The whole time she watched, she talked to neighbors, determined to take her neighborhood back. So she organized her neighbors into Neighbors for an Improved Community. They joined the Figueroa Quarter Coalition for Economic Justice. We're placing 1,200 people in jobs this year from that coalition's community benefits agreement. She's on the board of the Figueroa Quarter Community Land Trust. She's a planning commissioner now. We got the school to be built on the site of an abandoned dairy. We saved the neighborhood, and now neighborhood kids can go to the school. I don't know why the school district couldn't figure that out. Cecelia is she's one of many, many, many grassroots urban planners who are taking back the land, the plans, the ideas of who and what the city is for. And she's at the edge of history. And so are all of us. All of us are sitting at the edge of history. So as we sit, facing race, barely balanced at the pinnacle of neoliberalism, where public sector, public sphere, public money, and as of a few weeks ago, even private money, have been stripped so bare that it seems as though very little is left but private property rights, we have fantastic hope because of people like Cecelia and because we have in cities across the country, across the world, place-based organizing, demanding a right to the city. Thank you so much. I'm honored to speak to you.
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to greet all of you in struggle, in solidarity, in peace, and with a lot of hope and optimism. This is an amazing time to be in the United States at a very important moment. We were all watching the elections, and I think by extension, we all participated in the elections. But apart from that, it's an critical moment to have this debate, and I'd like to thank the organizers for making this possible. My grandmother used to say that there's nothing new under the sun. Nothing is new under the sun. We can call it different things, call it new things, call it other things, but there's nothing new. So trade is not new. Globalization is not new. We can call it imperialism. Well, we can call it colonialism. We can call it global capitalism. But they all are related. They're all the same family. They all live in the same neighborhood. It's all the same thing. Okay? And I think that the reason and that the thing that's a bit different about this particular era of the free trade experience, because free trade is also not new, is basically the manner in which certain communities and certain societies and certain countries and nations have had to take on a different role. Africa has typically been at the center of the global economy. Asia and Latin America, we know this. What is different now is our terms of engagement. They're uncomfortable. They don't fit very nicely. They're tight. They don't look good. They don't suit us, and they don't benefit us in any way whatsoever. What they do is instead, they presuppose the existence of equal power relations, which is not true. They presuppose equal gender relations, which is not true either. And they also presuppose equal race relations, equal access to resources, and an equal voice in setting the economic agenda. All lies. Big secret. All lies. Not true at all. Okay? And the ascendance of the World Trade Organization has only served to confirm this big, fat lie, which the neoliberal agenda is trying to feed all of us in different ways. And I think one of the struggles that we face in addressing struggle, one of the challenges of addressing struggle is basically one of definition. Okay? How do we define this? There's a groundswell that says that true development lies way beyond growth, efficiency. Okay, and all these tidy little indexes that we're typically assaulted by. It tells us that really we need to think about the function of development that leads to dignified lives. Dignified on all levels. And it's a multifaceted, multidimensional approach to development, which cuts across race, gender, class imperatives. Okay? And we need to think then about why it is then that there's such a measure of reluctance to concede that these prevailing trade regimes, that the language that we're using right now in this neoliberal globalized era is not satisfactory at all. That we need to think about social indicators and social relations relating to gender and race, which truly advance a different kind of economic and social citizenship, a citizenship that we can all relate to and all speak to, and which most importantly benefits us without deficit power relations. Okay? Where's my space? Sorry, 2 seconds. So I think this really leads me to say that it's important to frame this within a context of citizenship and global citizenship, among other things, as a context, because we're living in very strange times. These are hazardous times. These are very scary times. The war of globalization, the dispossession of women, the genocide upon culture as well, this whole uniculturalism that we're besetted by. And these things have all located all of us in different ways as refugees of the modern state. Okay? And I think that what is the point, then we need to ask ourselves, what's the value of human rights in the midst of so many human wrongs? What is the value of our citizenship if it doesn't advance our humanity in any way, shape, or form? And a lot of people at home in our African context are like, what's the point of voting? Voting doesn't put a single grain of rice on my plate. It doesn't keep me any warmer in the winter. It doesn't add a single dollar to my paycheck. What am I voting for? What is the use? Okay? And we need to think then about how the state then has also abdicated in its responsibility of providing us with some kind of citizenship that we can get behind. The state as a benefactor, the state as a provider, the state as a protector, whether that's social services, whether that's labor rights, across the whole paradigm. What then is the role of the state? And again, what is the point of our citizenship if we cannot even trust the state to protect us? Now, the global project of colonialism and colonization in all its forms, including globalization, I would suggest has had one roaring success. It has created a new other. And that otherness means that some are prescribed as less and given less permission to be, less human, less deserving of basic social justice, of cultural expression, of economic access, of ownership, of autonomy as well. And this basically gives permission to a self-exalted, self-appointed few to describe and prescribe and determine the lives of the majority. And that majority is actually most of us. For those of us who are not white or male or middle class, that's a huge population of otherness. And I like to call them the manys. We, the manys, are more than this tiny exalted few. And racism is actually based, as we know, on basic economics. The slave trade, colonialism, these were all economic ventures. Apartheid, I hate to say, didn't come down as much because of our global efforts. That's part of it. It came down because it was no longer economically viable. It just wasn't sexy anymore. It just wasn't profitable anymore. It was just too much of a stink. And that is the truth of the matter. Now, globalization has done a great job of legitimizing a standard of life determined by this exclusive minority, self-appointed such as they are, and that these are the few who define for us and set very arbitrarily that $1 a day is sufficient expression of our humanity. That is what we are deserving of, okay? But frankly, we the manys, we deserve to be full. We deserve a fair day's wage for a hard day's work. We all deserve it. We deserve to breathe the same clean air, send our children to the schools we want to send them to be educated, to be affirmed, to have our cultural expression. Because we the manys are indeed the many. We are the majority within the majority, not the minority within the minority, not at all. And I think that when we look at the manner in which the state is auctioning off its functions to us by cutting back on healthcare, on water provision, and really by completely stepping back and opening the door and being an enabler for global capitalism and creating this so-called enabling environment in our communities, we see that we really are in a crisis, because the problematic of the role of the father state is again rescinded again even further at the altar of so-called market access and the neoliberal agenda. I'd also like to say that that the citizen's basic expectation of the state has to encompass protection and provision of accessible services, but accessible self-expression. Not self-expression at a cost of being othered and being called, you funny little black girl with the accent, as I was called growing up in the diaspora, but being given full expression, you know? Not you in the corner with the funny name, but being given full cultural expression, dignity, and respect. Isn't that what we all deserve? Now, basically, today's international political economy, in which undemocratic institutions systematically generate economic inequality, systematically, deliberately, this could be characterized as global apartheid, okay? Because global apartheid is an international system of minority rule whose attributes include differential access to human rights, wealth and power, structured by race and place, structural racism embedded in global economic processes, political institutions, and cultural assumptions and misassumptions. Okay? And again, the international practice of double standards that always assume inferior rates to be appropriate for those others, we the manys, okay, defined by location or origin or race or gender or any other kind of other that people can't pronounce or just can't be bothered to try and engage with. And global apartheid, thus defined, is much more than a metaphor. The concept captures fundamental characteristics of the current world order, which are sometimes missed by the usual labels around neoliberalism, globalization, corporate globalization, global capitalism. But what it does, importantly, is it defines what is fundamentally unacceptable about the way we are treated, what is fundamentally unacceptable about the assumptions that these few self-exalted make about us, and the kind of choices that they have the ability to make about us. And they don't even have the courtesy to include us in these conversations. That is what this definition helps us to do. And what it also does is that it also strips this current agenda, it strips it of its aura of invisibility, invincibility, and also inevitability. No, it is not inevitable. No, it is not invincible. We can see with all this bailout stuff that's going on, it's clearly not invincible. It's clearly not unassailable. And this puts global justice and democracy, real democracy, people's democracy, on the agenda as the requirements for transformation. I'm going to close and say, it's not true that when you snooze, you lose. I want to tell you a story about the crocodile. There's a story that I like telling, and I don't think there's anybody in this room who's ever heard it before, so that's good. But the crocodile story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was in a place far away, there was a young woman in a certain queendom. And every single year, there used to be this contest to see who could get across the lake. And year after year after year, nobody dared to even go to the shore of this lake. Now one day, everybody's like, what's going on? And they're like, there's this woman, and she's getting across this shark-infested, crocodile-infested river. And they're like, oh my gosh, she's doing it. She's actually going to do it. So at the end, she gets to the other side. And the queen of this queendom, I'm a feminist, it has to be the queen of this kingdom. The queen of this queendom, obviously, she's got, all these riches and, gold and silver and diamonds and cattle and all of these things and a BlackBerry and all of these things waiting for this amazing young woman who had made it across the water. And of course, the first question is, so how did you do it? And why did you do it? And she says, I didn't. I fell in, and I just kept going. So I say, friends and comrades, we might not have asked for this, but we're in the lake now. Let's get out there and kill some crocodiles. You coming with me?
Well, I don't have a crocodile story, but I was going to start with a story, but try to put the crocodile out of your mind while I start this other story. I was going to tell a story about one of my very dear friends who is a product of globalization, as so many of us are. And if you read Rinku and Mamdou's book, The Accidental American, he's mentioned in there. His name is Sekou Sibi, and he's an immigrant from Ivory Coast, Abidjan, which is West Africa. And he came to this country. He was a student organizer involved in political campaigns in Ivory Coast. And then, you know, conflict erupted, and he really had to get out, came to the United States. Now, Sibi back home in Ivory Coast was a French teacher. He had a degree. He was incredibly, you know, a lot of people turned to him. He was very respected in the community. He speaks more than 4 or 5 languages. He speaks French, Spanish, English, and 2 or 3 African languages, and, you know, just incredibly well respected, came to the United States and ended up working in restaurants, like so many people who come from all over the world, and ended up on 9/11 working at Windows on the World, the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center. And Sibi always says, you know, Sibi had a hard time after 9/11 because the weekend before 9/11, he was playing soccer with a lot of the immigrant workers who ended up dying that day, and actually would have worked that morning shift, but switched shifts, something happened, ended up not working, ended up surviving, and all the people that he worked with every day ended up dying that day. And so, you know, the thing about Sibi, though, Sibi was our very first member at ROC, and I'll tell you what ROC is, and then, you know, as a restaurant worker, and then became an organizer, and then became a lead organizer, and now is executive director of the organization in New York. But the thing about him is he's just the most peaceful, you know, collected, like amazing person you'll ever meet. But he has so much history. If you talk to him about how he came, why he came, and, you know, meeting him, you'd never know that he speaks 6 or 7 languages. And he only tells you he speaks 4, but he actually speaks a lot more. So anyway, you know, Sibi kind of epitomizes what is going on globally, and then how it affects us locally. So the restaurant industry right now, you know, Walmart may be the single biggest private employer nationwide, but in terms of a sector or an industry, the restaurant industry now is the largest private sector employer by far in the United States. It's about 13 million employees nationwide, and it's part of this global phenomenon of, obviously, manufacturing either leaving the United States, and the part that a lot of people don't think about is actually just manufacturing jobs disappearing completely because of technology. So what's taking over is a service economy, both in the United States and worldwide. And within the service economy, it is the restaurant industry in particular that is growing with leaps and bounds. And we are in an economic crisis, it's true, and just like Walmart, the restaurant industry somehow is managing to stay very steady and continuing, in fact, to grow during every hit it gets in local areas and around the country. So in New York, after 9/11, the industry continued to skyrocket faster than any other industry. In New Orleans, there are now more restaurants post-Katrina than there were pre-Katrina. And the one that always shocks me and I love to share is Detroit, because Detroit is one of those places that they say has been in a permanent recession or depression for a very long time, and we always seem to forget about it. And, you know, as somebody who's tried to raise money for it, I know nobody wants to fund Detroit. But is the most amazing place, because as auto jobs have left Detroit, it's the restaurant industry that's taken over in a huge way. And in fact, there are now as many restaurant worker jobs in Detroit as there are in New York City, if you can believe that. And it's in part because the service economy continues to grow. And as we started to organize restaurant workers in Detroit, you know, obviously most of the workforce is African American. There are tons of laid off auto workers that are now moving into the restaurant industry. But you know there's a huge Arab population, and we're discovering all these other hidden immigrant communities as well. There's a huge and growing Bangladeshi community in Detroit that's there because post 9/11, all these Bangladeshis faced all this discrimination in New York City and decided to move to Detroit, Michigan. And so you've got this amazing, talk about black-brown alliances and the ability to build unity. I mean, Detroit is this place where so much could happen. There's so much potential. But it's typically ignored. And I just use that as an example to say that service economy is growing, restaurant industry in particular is growing really, really rapidly. And the part that most people don't know is, yes, in large part, it's very low and poverty wage jobs. There's terrible problems in this industry, terrible exploitation, and it's being filled by all these people who've been globalized out of their countries, either due to land loss, a lot of them, or political issues that a lot of times the United States is responsible for, or whatever else, coming and filling this industry and being incredibly exploited. So that's the majority of the industry, but the part that most people don't know is that there actually really are living wage jobs in this industry. A fine dining server in a fine dining restaurant in New York, or frankly, even in Detroit or LA, can make more than $100,000 a year. There are fine dining restaurants in New York where people make up to $200,000 a year in tips. The issue is that people of color and immigrants are not able to access those jobs. They've been systematically locked out. There's a glass ceiling where workers get up to that busser or runner position, and then they're not able to advance to the really living wage jobs in the industry. So very recently, ROC, which is the Restaurant Opportunity Center, ROC United is a national restaurant workers organization that grew out of a local organization called ROC New York, which myself and Mamdouh, the co-author of The Accidental American, founded right after 9/11. Our model is to fight really large, high-profile restaurant companies and get them to change their ways and do things that they never would have thought of doing, like provide paid sick days and promotions and health insurance and job security and grievance procedures. We've been able to win these things for thousands of workers, in addition to about $5 million in stolen tips and unpaid wages. That's one aspect of our work, but at the same time, we are promoting a high road. Thanks. We are creating an alternative. We are showing a different way of doing things. So while we're organizing workers in these low-road restaurants, we're at the same time organizing employers that are doing the right thing and providing good wages and good working conditions. And part of that work has been opening our own worker-owned restaurant called Colors, which is a restaurant in the evening, and during the day, it's a huge training facility where we train workers of color to advance to these living wage jobs. And then we do a lot of research and policy. And that's one little piece I wanted to talk to you about is we just finished a big report. We did this huge study, and ARC actually is helping us write it all up and put it out in January. It basically focused on race and discrimination. We sent 225 pairs of white and people of color applicants into these fine dining restaurants to see who would get hired. So they were white and people of color folks that we tried to make them look exactly as close to each other as we could. In fact, Sibi was one of the testers. So Sibi, this tall, 6-foot African man, was paired with a equally tall white man, and they had to spend time like mimicking each other and learning each other's personalities so that when they walked into the restaurant, there was absolutely no other factor that could emerge from why they were treated differently than their race. And of course, so many times, the white man would walk into the restaurant and be hired on the spot, and Sibi would be told over and over again, we're not hiring now, we're not hiring now. And that happened over and over again, and the report's coming out in January that, 225 different pairs, Sibi was among them, but we also just went out to restaurants and counted how many white people were in the front and how many people of color were in the back. Well, I tell you this because, partly so you'll read the report in January, but also because now we've gone national. Now we've set up ROCs in Detroit, Chicago, Maine, New Orleans, and Miami. We're opening up ROC LA in March. But we're also kind of beginning to interact with the global restaurant workers movement. And that really has to be the solution to everything we're talking about. It has to be about developing international labor standards and developing international worker solidarity around the world. And that sounds so cliched and like old school, but there are new and creative ways of doing things here, which I think ROC is among, but there are really amazing and creative things that are happening around the world as well that we are beginning to import. And that's a different kind of globalization. So just one example, we've been in talks with restaurant workers in England and in Canada, but most recently we got to meet with the Restaurant Worker Union in Mexico, thanks to Tigra taking us there, thanks to Francis. And so we met with them and we actually asked them, so do you ever have this problem where they hire the white people in the front in these fine dining restaurants in Mexico City and the darker skinned Mexicans in the back? And they said, you know, well actually, we never really had that issue before. You know, I don't know how much, well, they said we never really had that issue before, but more recently, all these American corporations have started to come into Mexico City and set up hotels and set up restaurants. And usually they come in and the first thing they say is, could we have a tall, white-skinned Mexican working in the front of the house? And they ask for that when they come. And you know, so it's become a problem. And what this means is that globalization is not just about exporting horrible jobs and exporting exploitation. It's also about exporting our very unique American racism. You know, we are globalizing American racism. And not to say that these countries didn't have their own issues with skin color. I come from a country that's obsessed with skin color. I'm about to finish. Obsessed with skin color, but there is a very unique American racism that we are exporting, and what is the response to that? It's globalizing racial justice and importing racial and economic justice and importing amazing ideas. So for example, with our cooperative, you know, importing the idea of a worker-owned restaurant that actually could go to scale, that's owned by people of color and immigrants, importing the idea of worker solidarity, because it's happened in a lot of other places around the world and is kind of new to us. The idea of really learning from and working with people from around the world. But what it means for us in the long term, very practically, and I just want to end with this because I feel the need to have practical solutions, not just talk big. So practical solution, one, a campaign where universally we refuse to allow lighter-skinned folks to work in the front of the house jobs, right? Universally, we stand in solidarity with the workers in Mexico, and together we fight the same corporations, and we're starting to do this, the same restaurant companies that are asking for this kind of hierarchy. That's one. But two, that we even think beyond our own silos, as was said this morning. So we've created a new alliance of workers up and down the food chain. Farm workers, meat and poultry processing workers, food retail and distribution workers, supermarket workers, and restaurant workers. And one of the groups in the alliance is an international food workers group that, you know, is working with farm workers in Africa and Latin America. Because we know that the food system is international. We know that our food comes from elsewhere and ends up on our table in the fancy fine dining restaurant. But the labor is not talking to each other. And so we created this alliance particularly to bring us together and ultimately impact the food system. So now we go to these big fancy conferences like Slow Food Nation and we say, you know, as long as you're thinking about sustainable and local food, let's talk about sustainable labor conditions, because you're never, ever going to have a sustainable food system without sustainable labor conditions. Especially because all these fancy products you keep making of alternative and locally grown, nobody's ever going to be able to afford them if none of us have good wages, and that's the last thing I'm going to end up on. We want some economic stimulus, let's raise the minimum wage, because there's no better economic stimulus than putting money in the pockets of people who most need it and who will spend to stimulate our economy, both here and abroad. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, unfortunately, he's no longer here, but I would like to extend a challenge to Sherman Alexie to have a big head face-off. Filipinos have big heads too. Thank you, Rinka. Well, I woke up this morning, and as you could hear, feeling pretty awful. My throat hurts, my head's in a cloud, and I can barely keep my eyes open. For a moment there, I entertained the idea of not being on this panel. But then I thought that Rinku would kick me off the ARC board, lose her friendship that's so dear to my heart, and the prospect of being able to share the final moments of this historic conference with you all got me out of my doldrums. Then I thought there probably is a reason for being sick just in time on this panel, or for this panel on the global economy. Because if we magnified my situation 200 million-fold, people around the world have been made sick by the global economy and are forced to move and look for work just to support their families and get better. It is the story of my family, which I will come back later. And a central part of what we should be fighting for is the right of people to stay. First, a quick history on why communities of the Global South and our communities here have been made sick by this global economy. Corporations, governments of the North, and the elites in the South have forced a sickening economic environment for most of the world's people, Liepollo's the Menis, but felt most acutely by those who've been formerly colonized. They've given us these toxic pills since the 1970s. 1, Reaganism, Thatcherism in the North, and structural adjustment policies in the South redistributed income to the top, them hoping that this will stimulate economic growth and continue to expand profits for corporations. Number 2, integration of economies into the global market economy by removing barriers to the mobility of goods and capital to expand markets and find sources of cheap labor and materials. Number 3, when these weren't working as planned, they stoked the financial markets with more and more exotic products to extract profits without creating new value with goods and services to support them, leading to a hyperactive financial economy but a stagnant real economy, thus producing the dot-com and real estate bubbles, as well as the financial crises in Asia in the 1990s, in Mexico in the early 90s, in Argentina in the early part of this century. So at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, we find ourselves in a global recession that is not likely to abate anytime soon. It is fundamentally the supersization of a tried and true economic model of resource extraction and exploitation of people to meet the demands of an elite-dominated economic paradigm. This bailout scheme is meant to give it life support. And one of the human consequences of failed global economic policies is mass migration. A few pieces of data. 1 in 35 people in the world today lives in a country that they weren't born in. If taken as a whole, it will be the 5th largest country in the world. Cities have absorbed 2/3 of the world's population since 1950, and growing at 1 million babies and migrants each week. Migrants have tripled in North America since 1970, from 13 to 41 million. And the color and gender of migration have changed as well. The vast majority coming from the formerly colonized countries of the Global South and the former Soviet Union. And since the mid-1990s, there have been more women migrants than men. The phenomenon of mass migration has become a new terrain for the old economic order. Export of labor has been a central economic policy for developing countries to meet the demands of cheap labor in the North. In the Philippines, for example, the government exports 3,000 workers each day to more than 132 countries, and is dependent on their remittances, or money that they sent back home to their families, for 15% of its GDP. Remittances constitute at least 10% of the GDP of 15 countries in the world today, and growing. There is a multi-billion-dollar industry devoted to money transfer to capture the $360 billion per year, and growing, that's sent through the wires by these migrant workers. It's an industry that's largely unregulated and extracts wealth from the most economically marginalized communities all over the world. And with the check cashing, payday loan, pawn shops littered in low-income communities of color, this industry functions as the financial institution for poor people all over the world, taking advantage of their need to support loved ones. If these migrant workers, expelled from their countries and communities by the need to work and support their families, were considered a company and their remittances as revenues, they will be the 3rd largest company in the world, just behind Walmart and ExxonMobil. And therein lies the potential. The power of their money to change the economic equation that has led to their displacement, and that can allow the next generation the option to stay or to migrate. And that's the vision that we embark on with Tigra. And I'd like to reflect on our strategy to accomplish this and extract some lessons for our broader effort to transform the global economy that can help realize racial justice in our lifetime. Number one, going after corporate targets that depend on our money. We need to isolate those that are invested in the old economic order and win over, however tactical it seems, those willing to take risks with a new business model. In our case, we're signing transnational community benefits agreements with money transfer companies that commit to reinvest at least 1% of their pre-tax profits back to communities, engage in profit sharing with organizations that work with them, and adopt racial justice screens on their investments. Like, for example, they will not invest in projects that further displaces communities all around the world. But accountability isn't enough. We want to promote and create alternative systems that can serve the immediate needs of people, but also build for the long term. We want companies and governments to assist migrant workers to save and invest a portion of their remittances, to support and strengthen community-based economic projects, to create more vibrant communities so that migration can become an option and not a necessity for livelihood. We'd like to increase our control of financial flows within and between countries, and to support sustainable and empowering development projects with the surplus value of our labor through savings and investment. Another world isn't just possible, it can be made real right now. Finally, we need to develop and nurture a constituency rallying around big ideas and self-assured about its unapologetic claim that we can change the course of history. And all of this is personal. I know something about the value of that monthly money transfer. It meant clothes and books for school, even a celebration feast of more than fried fish and spam once in a while. But $250 a month, sent faithfully by my mother working as a nurse's aide in San Francisco, didn't prevent my family from having to move and separate. It didn't prevent my father from seeing one by one his kids leave for the United States. My father, the son of a sharecropper, the first of his clan from a small rural town in the Philippines to make it to the capital city of Manila. He had become a self-employed lawyer and helped raise 8 kids so that each one can go to college. This proud man was trying to keep his self-respect intact as he had to accept the fact that he could no longer provide for his family. He had to redefine his role with my mother, with his kids, and with his own image he had of himself. He spent his last years back in the rural town of his youth. I never did ask him how he felt about all of this, how he eventually reconciled the course of his life and his family's. He died in the basement of the house on stilts where he grew up, a house that now shelters a new generation of sharecroppers. Remittances and the migration of an entire family failed to fundamentally change the collective destiny of Calpoturas in rural Philippines. And I suspect that my family's experience is much like many of yours here. If we don't change the significance of each remittance, nothing will change. If we don't embrace the potential of remittances to rewrite historic storylines for the next generation of humanity, nothing will change. If we don't vigorously assert that all of this is within our grasp, then nothing will change because we have not changed. Our collective agenda is a history-altering agenda. It seeks to redefine our family's relationship with governments and corporations. Our sweat, our endurance, our ingenuity, and our indomitable spirits have carried us to this moment. So we can tell the story of when we had to risk everything to travel to the unknown, and how we learned to persevere even when we were met with hateful ignorance. Yes, I deem that it is no accident that we found ourselves here at this moment in our journey, and we're asked to risk once more for transformational action from below for a different and better world for all of us. Yes, this is the time. Yes, this is the moment. And this is the conference, and we can take this conference as the occasion for us to declare our time has come. Thank you very much.
I mentioned earlier that we had assembled the most amazing panel in the world on this stage, and I think you would all agree with that, right? The first question I want to ask each of our panelists, in the context of the work, some of the work they've shared with us, is about the current economic crisis. Now, all of you were engaged in certain kinds of organizing models, advancing an alternative paradigm around economic and racial justice before the last few months. How does the current crisis affect the work that you've been already doing?
Okay, because I was very obedient with the timekeeper, I didn't tell you what we actually do. So I'll tell you real quickly. Like when I talk about land reform, I'm not talking about land reform in Central America. When I talk about land reform in Los Angeles, we're just we're dealing with our objective conditions. So we're trying to criminalize slumlords instead of the people who live in the buildings. We're trying to expand tenants' rights because most people in LA don't own property. We're trying to restructure redevelopment so that people don't get pushed out and that they benefit from investment. We want to make sure that development provides housing, jobs, and income. And we're really trying to give people more control over the land, which is why we started a land trust, why we started a people's planning school, why I went out and bought a pop-up trailer and pimped it out and now drive it around the neighborhood so we can do planning school right up on your driveway and stuff like that. Okay, because we need to take back the land and stuff. And so what's happened in the economic crisis is that, and I told you the story, and you know, historic redlining in South Central Los Angeles and stuff like that. Anyways, is that financial institutions holding paper on all these bad loans. Some of the tenants, you know, don't even know that their building's been sold, et cetera, et cetera. And so we really need to start having conversations with some of those institutions. Okay, so anyways.
Okay, I think some of the things that we do in terms of lobbying, advocacy, modeling, noise making, and being general irritants is making linkages across sectors. So that is linking with popular movements, popular struggles. So it's kind of the inside, outside. It's hot outside, it's hot inside as well. Linking with students, movements, the Right to Work campaign with labor movements, and coming out at this globalization animal, neo-colonial animal from different angles and just taking different bites of it. But the other thing as well is pressurizing policymakers and really continuously naming and shaming and discrediting this current model by linking it with issues around current, you know, interest rates, food price hikes, some of the stuff that Saru, you were talking about as well, and looking at causes, because oftentimes one of the things that makes it that is critical for popular mobilization is to link it in lived experience in terms that we can all relate to, that means something to us, okay? And I think creating opinion and popular opinion and different opinion, we do a lot of reading, writing, and we make noise all over the place, is part of that.
Yeah, I really agree with the panel this morning and the thought that this is an amazing opportunity right now. crisis. Crisis is an amazing opportunity because, you know, one example is the restaurant industry. People say, oh, you know, the industry's going to fail, slow down, jobs are going to be lost. You know, and again, Detroit is this amazing example of a place that's been in economic crisis for a very long time, and you can drive around downtown Detroit any day and see some new restaurant opening up. I mean, if that is kind of what's going on around the country too. Some places are going to slow down or shut down, but there's a lot of other places that aren't. It's like Mamdouh says, people eat out when they're depressed, and they do. And the industry is going to continue to grow. But see, the problem is that even amongst ourselves, even among the left, even among the progressives, there's this idea that during an economic crisis, we should somehow shift and focus on this new economic crisis rather than using it as an opportunity to frame what we've been fighting for all along as why what we've been fighting for is so critical now, right? Because, for example, clearly deregulation failed. Doesn't work. Deregulation never worked. And so rather, you know, when we go up and fight a restaurant and say they're not paying minimum wage, they're not doing the right thing, and people are like, how could you fight a restaurant now in this crisis? Deregulation failed. We need regulation, clearly. Everybody needs to be regulated if we're all going to prosper. And that's the frame we keep using, and we're going to continue to use into the economic crisis, is this idea of collective prosperity. The only way we're going to get out is if we all get out. We all have to prosper together. The folks that were in a recession before, like in Detroit, if we don't bring them up with us, we're all going to suffer. And so the most frustrating part of that has been actually around the minimum wage. We at ROC, our big federal policy issue is the minimum wage for tip restaurant workers, which is $2.13 at the federal level. And you in California are lucky you don't have a tip credit, but most of the South, and frankly most of the country, the minimum wage for restaurant workers is $2.13. So we've been fighting with Senator Kennedy's office to get it moved up, and suddenly with the economic crisis, people are like, oh, we got to push it off the agenda. We can't talk about making business pay higher wages in a time when they're suffering. And, you know, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous because you just got to reframe it. And it is economic stimulus. There's no greater economic stimulus than increasing people's wages so they can spend, because the only way those businesses are going to come back around is if we have money to spend in them. So I think it's just an opportunity, and it's about reframing what we've been doing all this time as a way of, as what should have been done all along, and now is the way to solve the crisis.
Two quick impacts, one bad and one opportunity. The bad thing is that it really will increase the migration of folks from the global south to the north. Economies have been bad, as we know, and it's just getting worse. So that even the industry, the financial service industry, just did a survey of in their key markets around the world, and it showed that 30% of people that they surveyed were expecting to leave within 2 years, the countries. So that's a whole lot of people. Second part is the opportunity. There's been intense competition within the money transfer industry during the past 8 years, mostly because of technology. And with the economic downturn, it has forced some of them to look for new opportunities. And one of them is how they could partner with organizations and others if they've never partnered before, and be able then to work with those new institutions and new organizations, but be held accountable to certain standards. So I think that's kind of the opportunity that we're trying to grab onto and force, again, human dignity standards in partnerships with corporations.
Can you hear me? No, that one's not on. All right. So remember, I just got a sign that said this will be the last question. So I was going to say, pass your questions to the staff, but this will be the last question, and it goes, I think, to Gilda, but anyone on the panel can answer it. How can local communities of color facing displacement due to gentrification organize globally to stop being moved? And then we'll have a wrap-up question after this.
Okay, I'm not taking the microphone because I know the answer to the question. But so over the last just short of 2 years, grassroots organizations in cities around the country just started to ask the question, how can we do that nationally? And the way that we did that was by finding, we'd already been admiring each other's work, by finding the genius in each other and learning from each other and exchanging and building an idea of a national right to the city together. Okay, so we are actually trying to build movement around that, and it's going to take some time. But basically, it has a lot of regard for where innovation can possibly come from. But it came out of the fact that we understood that even when we're really successful, even if we do a community, whatever it is, that nationally, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. And so in thinking about the global question, I used to be in this really cool economics, popular education group called Just Economics that was all women who decided, we all decided we were economists and we were going to teach people about economics, and we do popular education about economics. It was a really great run of 10 years. And we just got together again about it. And one of my, to do a popular education on the current crisis and the banking stuff. And so that's the good news about the crisis. It's an opportunity to get back together again, like now. So what my research assignment was to look at the interesting things that were historical that I'd known like from the 80s about in other countries. The mutual housing associations, the building societies, the German mortgage societies, things that didn't go to hell in this handbasket. But as I started doing the research, one of the things I saw that had been exported with Thatcherism and Reaganism, and I never heard of this word before. There's a word like all mutual savings societies and stuff like that that during the Depression never got hurt because they were just owned by the people who made the loans to each other and there was no speculation, right? There's a word called demutualization, and there's all kinds of de-somethingizations of things that stopped being owned by the people who were investing in each other and started becoming speculative stock vehicles, which is how we've come to the moment today. And so one of the things, so I'm going to do my weak little answer to the question because we haven't done this yet, but one of the things that could happen, and there's different kinds of, we've hooked up with organizations around the world, but in a very tangential kind of way, in a respectful kind of way, like nice to meet you, and stuff like that. But we need to revisit our own histories in our own countries and share those. Because in terms of having a vision of what's possible, there were things that have worked in this country. There are things that worked in Germany. There were things that worked in England. There were all kinds of things that worked that have been destroyed by neoliberalism. And there's a whole lot of people who weren't even born, who are doing organizing right now, who are fabulous, who weren't even born when those things were alive. And so we need to share, we need to reinvigorate the things that worked, and I will stop.
Okay, no, we're not done yet. One last task for the panel, starting with Francis and working our way down. I'd like each panelist to take 1 minute to leave us with a sense of hope and optimism and possibility. And you can answer this question, or you can just, if you have a 1 minute wrap up, that's fine too. But the question is, how do we link all of our movements together at this moment? How do we link the workers' rights, immigrant rights, anti-globalization, anti-imperialist, racial justice movements around the world at this moment? Francis, how do we do this?
You tell him, Francis. You tell him.
And in 1 minute.
Yeah, in 1 minute.
Buy tickets. Plane tickets. There is no shortcut for meeting and seeing and being in the place where we want to be at. Right? And so I think part of the commitment for us is to see and physically be at those places. And so in building a global movement, we have to be able to see it with each other's eyes and be in the shoes of other folks. And the best place to do that is just to be in the neighborhoods, in the workplaces, in the context that people are struggling. And it will take a commitment for all of us to be that, to do that in this next period of time. But that's kind of the only place that's the only way that I could see us building the type of solidarity, building the type of relationship, building the type of vision that only comes from a real engagement, rooted in the histories and in the places that we come from, that a new vision will emerge.
We hate you, Dorian. Well, you know, I would just say, I really do believe in this idea of reframing everything as if it's not a deception. It's true that we all do better when we all do better. You know, this idea of shared prosperity, this idea of collective prosperity. So how does that work to build movement? Well, so in our example, how do we do collective prosperity? And I always tell the gross stories. So those of you who have heard it before, I'm sorry, you just ate lunch. But, you know, in the restaurant industry, we always say, we've collected hundreds of anecdotes, we've done a ton of research to show that it's the same employers who violate labor laws that also violate consumer health code, that do really nasty, gross, disgusting things to your food. So workers who are forced to come to work while sick, sneeze and cough into your food. Workers who are working under severe time pressure, cut themselves and the finger and the blood falls into the food and they're forced to serve it. We've had workers tell us that they burn themselves and the burnt skin falls into the food and they're forced to serve it. Or, you know, they drop the food repeatedly and they're under, you know, it happens. Most of my members don't eat in the restaurants where they work because this happens. And so, you know, we've used it as a frame to help people understand that unless you treat workers well, everybody's going to suffer, right? Restaurant workers have to do well so that consumers do better, and frankly, even so that employers do better, because we've been able to prove data-wise that there's better profits in treating your workers better. So it's this whole idea of if you treat one group better, the group that's maybe the most oppressed, then we'll all do better. And the same is true for movement building, right? So if folks in prison who are incarcerated are working for pennies on the dollar or working for, you know, slave wages, then that drives down wages for everybody, right? So that's a way to bring folks who work on criminal justice together with the labor movement. You know, if immigrants are not allowed to have the right to full working, decent opportunities to work, then that drives down wages for native-born workers in all industries. If immigrant workers don't have the right to organize, then frankly nobody will, because employers will always prefer the workers that don't have the right to organize. I can't tell you the number of people who've come to me and said, I got fired for trying to become legal, because the employer will always prefer you in the undocumented status. So as long as there's exploitation anywhere, there's exploitation everywhere. And the only way that we can build a common movement is to help people understand the commonalities and the ways that if we don't all prosper, nobody will.
Like my grandmother said, there is nothing new under the sun. Struggle is not new, and victories are not new. We have history on our side. We have the victories over slavery, at least the first wave of transatlantic slavery. We have the colonial struggles because we dared to dream and be audacious enough to think that we could be the captains of our own destinies, to think that we could live self-determined lives, to think that we could have self-determining access to our own systems of justice, of governance, to our own land, to our own resources. So there's nothing new under the sun. And you know, there's, I think it's Alice Walker who says that her activism is her rent for living on this planet. And I say that my activism, but the fact that I'm breathing, is proof that my activism is still alive. The fact that we are still here in this collective consciousness is truth and fact and evidence that we have not been vanished, that we have not been othered out of the landscape, and that we, the manys, are still here. So let us all take one deep collective breath and remember that for as long as we have breath, we do have hope. We will not be othered and we will not be disappeared, we will not be vanished, because we are still the manys.
I was so hoping I wouldn't ever have to speak after her. And I hope you take this in the spirit in which it's offered. So the question was, you know, what gives us hope? Where do we find hope and stuff? And so the other day, I was with people and we were all asked to say why we do our work. And just to get to the core of it, I mean, I don't know how any other reason that anyone would do organizing besides being motivated by powerful feelings of love. And I mean that in a lot of different levels. And so just personally, I love people, I love human beings, I love all of you, okay? And, you know, I love the city that I live in. I love it that I, at 57 years old, work in organizations with 22-year-olds, you know, that I'm learning from them, that I'm working in national organization, that I'm in international networks. And I so admire the spirit of this conference and the spirit with which people have come to it, not just to be in their comfort zone, but to stretch and to break through barriers. It's in a racist society, we, you know, and I don't want to say any cliches, but what's important is that we are struggling with these issues, and that if we do it in a loving way and we do it together, then we shall prevail.
Well, in love and struggle, let's thank Francis, Saru, Liepollo, and Gilda for a fantastic closing plenary. And because these are all extraordinary people, as you heard, and extraordinary organizers and thinkers, I just want to make one last point, and this is for Rinku, wherever she is. We are ending on time because we have work to do. So on that note, I'll hand it over to Daisy.
Thank you. Thank you. Another round of applause for the panel. They're amazing.